We'd like to welcome Father
James.
I was going to say. Father James Clark is here today. He is one of the associate pastors at OLPH right now. He's been out of the country studying some canon law stuff, and we're really happy to have him. Father Clark was a gift to St. Anne from us and a good personal friend of mine. And today he's going to be unpacking a little bit about marriage and annulments. So let's give a warm welcome to Father James Clark.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Hail Mary, full of grace.
The Lord is with you.
Blessed
Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Now, somebody were asking you, are you a good driver? And you said, well, no, I'm not. Well, why? Have you had a wreck? No. You get a lot of speeding tickets? No. Well, then why aren't you a good driver? Because I don't know how to take an engine apart. What does that have to do with driving? You don't have to be able to build a car to be able to be a good driver, right?
No.
What is it people are usually interested in, though? It depends on what their needs are. Do you need a mechanic or do you need a chauffeur? It makes a big difference. Most of the time when you hear a priest or anybody talking about marriage, they're going to be talking to you more about how to build your relationship and how to raise children, those kinds of things. I'm not going to talk to you about that. I'm going to talk to you about the mechanics. What is it fundamentally? What are the necessary parts? What is the structure of it? And for that, we'll start by looking at the Code of Canon Law, which for each of the 7 sacraments, it has a canon that explains what the sacrament is, what it's for. The Code says that the matrimonial covenant, by which a man and a woman establish between themselves a partnership of the whole of life, and which is ordered by its nature to the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of offspring, has been raised by Christ the Lord to the dignity of a sacrament between the baptized. There are about 10 different points in that one little canon, aren't there? So let's think about it. Marriage is a covenant. What is a covenant? At its root, it's basically a contract. Now, when most people, if somebody came up to you off the street and said, tell me about what marriage is, at what point in the conversation would you get around to the point of saying it's a contract? People don't think like that, do they? When you start thinking, what is it that really made my marriage work? You wouldn't say, because we were committed to our contract. People don't think like that. That's understandable. But at its heart, a covenant is a kind of contract. And therefore, a marriage begins by 2 people entering into a covenant with one another, a contract. What is it for? Notice that the Code says specifically that by its nature, we need to change out the battery. Oh. So the Code says that by its nature, marriage is ordered to 2 things. The good of the spouses. That's kind of a no-brainer, isn't it? You know, your marriage is supposed to help both of you to grow and flourish. But also the second part, which many people today do not believe is part of the nature of marriage, but it is, the procreation and education of children. Unfortunately, in our society, especially thanks to the availability of all kinds of contraceptives, people no longer think marriage, children. They don't go together necessarily in their minds. They think, well, we're going to get married, but we don't want children. Well, that's a contradiction in terms. What do you mean you're going to get married, but you don't want children? Why? Are you too old to have children? Well, that would be understandable. No, he's going to go get a vasectomy. Well, is that really a marriage? Well, it's certainly not a marriage in the Christian sense of the term. And it's not a marriage in the sense of the Catholic Church. That's not a marriage at all. If you get married to someone saying, we're not going to have children, even though we're capable, we're not going to have them, that is an invalid marital contract. That marriage, in the eyes of the church, never really came into existence. Because procreation of children and their education is an essential property of marriage if the people are capable of having children. That doesn't mean that they have to have 20 children, but it does mean that they have to be open to the possibility of having children. So that is an essential property of marriage, or an essential purpose of marriage. The code says that the essential properties of marriage are unity and indissolubility. So when you get married to your wife, you are assuming a oneness together. We call it a one-flesh union based on the book of Genesis. But you're supposed to be a team, in a sense, working together. She's not just your slave or your housekeeper. She is your partner in life, and it has to be indissoluble. Therefore, if you marry somebody just wanting a maid to clean the house and cook, that's not a marriage. If you decide, well, I'm going to marry this person because they seem right for me right now, but later on, if it doesn't work out, we'll get divorced, then that's not a marriage either. Now, think about how controversial these things are that I've just told you. This is radically different from the view that most people have of marriage, isn't it? You know, if you wanted somebody to tell you a little bit more about how to make your relationship better with your wife, then you're probably not going to look to a priest to give you that talk. I could probably tell you some things that would be helpful for that, but you're probably going to want somebody who's married. But whenever it comes to the basics, the structure, the essential structure of what makes a marriage happen, it's really something that everybody can understand. And it's the most essential. Because if you don't understand the nature of what marriage is supposed to be, then how do you make it happen? Now, our Lord made things very difficult for a good reason. Our Lord says that if a man divorces his wife and marries another, he commits adultery against her. That's pretty harsh. Can you think of any Christian denominations that really still hold to that? I think we're about the only ones. Even the Orthodox will tolerate divorce and remarriage a couple times. But our Lord says it very categorically. In fact, the apostles say, well, if that's the case, then who should get them? It's better not to marry. Now, that's typical, isn't it? You know, you've got the apostle there like, what, if I can't get rid of her? Well, then I'm better off just not married. Well, it's a tough commandment. But that is why we say that the indissolubility is one of the essential properties of marriage. Now again, I'm not talking to you about the basics of how to make your marriage work well. I'm talking about the more essential structural parts of it. And it's not the most fascinating topic in the world, but it's so important. I'm here more to inform you than to inspire you. If you get some inspiration, that's great. But right now, primarily, I'm worried about information. Because this is something that most people don't understand, especially when it comes to annulments. First of all, annulment is a bad word. It is a faulty term. But we use it all the time because it's the most convenient. What does it mean to annul something? It means to take something which is valid and make it invalid, to nullify it. But that's a problem, because if two baptized Christians validly marry and consummate that marriage, then there is no power on earth that can dissolve it except death. Let me repeat that. If two baptized Christians get legally married, validly married, and consummate that marriage, there is no power on earth that can dissolve that marriage except death. So whenever I issue, at the tribunal, if I issue a decree of nullity, which is the proper term, I'm not nullifying anything. I am acknowledging that it was already null. That's a huge difference. If you want a decree of nullity from the tribunal, you have to give evidence and testimony and witnesses to prove to the tribunal that your marriage wasn't valid in the first place. That there was something so fatally flawed at the very beginning that you weren't truly married. You might have had the best of intentions. You might have had several children. You might have been together for 20 years. But if you want the decree of nullity, you have to prove that there was something fundamental that was flawed from day one. And sometimes that's hard to do, isn't it? Sometimes people will get very irritated when they apply to a tribunal for an annulment because we send out this questionnaire that asks all kinds of uncomfortable questions. And there's about, 5 to 7 pages of questions about everything related to your marriage, how you were raised, how your spouse was raised, all kinds of things. Even with some restraint, even, how was the sex life? I mean, people look at this questionnaire and they get indignant sometimes. And they call the tribunal and they say, I shouldn't have to do all of this. And what do you mean you want witnesses? So isn't the church merciful? And it's like, well, you don't understand what we do here. And it's understandable that they don't understand. Because it's so foreign from our modern way of thinking. What we do at the tribunal is try to help you prove a case. The case that your marriage was not valid. We are not handing out permission slips for remarriage. I do not have the authority to give you a permission slip to get married. The Pope doesn't even have that kind of authority. What we are there to do is to help you to be free to remarry by demonstrating that your first marriage was not valid to begin with. But if you cannot demonstrate that to the court, then I cannot help you. Sometimes people ask, well, how many annulments get granted? I couldn't give you statistics. I've only been in the tribunal for a few months now. But I can tell you that we don't just hand them out. We follow the procedures that the church gives us. A lot of people don't realize this is a court case. If you submit an application for an annulment, properly called the what? Decree of nullity, thank you. Then we send you a packet of information and assign you an advocate who's supposed to help you get your information on paper and draw up your formal petition. You submit it to me as the judicial vicar of the tribunal, and I look at the application and see, is there the basis here for a case? If there's no basis for a case there, I have to reject it. That doesn't mean you can't apply again. You can. Usually, I don't have to reject a petition. In fact, I don't think I ever have, maybe once. Usually, people will give me enough information that I can say, okay, we've got something we can go on here. We can help you. Then, once I accept it, I have to determine on what basis I'm going to argue your case. Or actually, I'm not going to argue it. I'm going to judge it. But I've got to determine on what basis you can argue your case. So, for example, based on what I just told you about the essential properties of marriage, what would be one, we call them grounds, what would be one ground for arguing, well, my marriage wasn't really valid because of what?
Too young. Mixed marriage outside the church.
Mixed marriage outside the church.
A Protestant and a Catholic, and they marry out in the barn by some minister.
Okay, so you've got a Catholic who gets married to a non-Catholic, and they get married at some destination wedding without the permission of the Catholic Church. Well, then that's invalid. But that's pretty easy to prove.
Yeah.
What about based on the definition I gave you?
No intention to having children.
No intention of having children. Perfect example. Perfect example. I'm going to argue, I petition the tribunal of the Diocese of Memphis to declare my marriage to so-and-so invalid due to the exclusion of children. That would be an example of something you could petition the tribunal for.
Once you get married, you really have raised your children Catholic, but somewhere down the road, one of the partners said, no, I don't want kids, I want to go to this school.
Okay, so what if you marry a non-Catholic, they agree, yes, we'll raise the children Catholic, but then later on down the road, they change their mind and say, I'm not going to do that. That's not necessarily a ground of nullity. It could be if you could prove that there was some fraud involved. And if you could prove from the very beginning this person never intended to raise the children Catholic, and you've got witnesses that can prove it, you might have a fraud case. But sometimes that's hard to do, isn't it? To find witnesses to attest to the fact, oh yeah, she told me, yeah, I told them I will raise the children Catholic, but I have absolutely no intention of doing that. I know it's important to him, but he's just going to have to get over it. Well, that's a perfect witness right there, if you can find that one, but it's kind of hard to prove that case, isn't it?
Father, I have a question. Are you supposed to be in the state of grace when you say your vows?
Are you supposed to be in the state of grace when you say your vows? Yes, you're supposed to be in the state of grace all the time.
Well, I understand that. But we're talking about that particular moment in time.
But does it affect the validity of the marriage? No.
It does not affect it.
It does not affect the
Okay.
validity of the marriage. Now, whether or not you're going to get any graces from that marriage, it does affect that.
No. I'm just wondering, you're mortal sin and you get married.
Now, there's something that's very important for people to understand. These annulments, declarations of nullity. I am not trying to determine whether or not your marriage was a sacramental marriage. Let that sink in. A lot of times people misunderstand the nature of a decree of nullity. They think that the tribunal is trying to determine whether or not your marriage was a sacrament.
Okay, that's what I was told.
I have no interest in that whatsoever. You know why? Because if both parties are baptized and they're validly married, it's a sacrament whether they think it is or not. I don't have any control over whether or not your marriage was sacramental.
Okay.
But I do have the ability to investigate whether or not it was valid, whether or not that contract was validly entered into. Let me give you some other examples of a basis of invalidity. If you could argue on the ground of contrary to the good of the spouses, that means that he was abusive before, during, and after the marriage, and it wasn't because he was mentally ill, it was just because he was cruel. Well, that's contrary to the good of the spouses. That person is not consenting to marriage. I don't know what they're consenting to, but it sure wasn't marriage. So that would be a ground of nullity. Just an example, one example. What about fraud? I'll give you a great example. This is sort of a landmark case in canon law, because a couple petitioned the tribunal for a decree of nullity based on fraud. And the difficulty was they had never had a case quite like this granted on the ground of fraud. So apparently the tribunals locally in Germany couldn't agree on this, so they sent it up to the Roman Rota, which is sort of like the main court of appeal at the Vatican. Here's the case. A young man and a young woman in Germany are wanting to get married. And in the presence of his parents, the groom's parents, they've talked many times about the fact that they can't wait to have children. And they are so eager to have children because they look forward to being a mother and father. The parents of the groom hear this. They know that that's one of the primary reasons they want to get married. But they never told their son that when he was a child, he had mumps, and the mumps descended and sterilized him. They never told him that. Now, they heard how much they're looking forward to children, and yet they still didn't say anything. They get married. They start trying to have children. Eventually, it's discovered the man is sterile. Now, is sterility a ground of nullity? Can you declare marriage invalid based on somebody who was sterile? No. Sometimes you get married, you find out one of you are sterile. That can be a great disappointment and bring a lot of sadness, but it doesn't mean your marriage wasn't valid. But the reason that marriage was declared valid by the Roman Rota is because the parents perpetrated fraud and deceit on that couple. And therefore, the woman consented to was being offered a product that she didn't intend to buy. If you'll pardon the analogy there. Because she specifically wanted children and was looking forward to it, and yet his parents knew, and yet they kept her in the dark to keep her going on with the marriage. And that's cruel, really. But that is an example of declaring a marriage null due to deceit, on the ground of deceit. Yes?
If one or the other party knows that they are sterile prior to the marriage, can there be a valid marriage?
If they're still what?
If one or the other is sterile and they know prior to the marriage, is that still a valid marriage?
It is, if one or the other is sterile and they know that prior to the marriage, is the marriage still valid? It can be, but if the sterile partner deceives the other partner, then it might invalidate. Now, sometimes people, they don't really understand that this is a court case. There's a procedure that annulments go through. Some annulments are simple. The simplest one is, there was a Catholic involved, but he didn't get married in front of a Catholic witness. So that's what we call getting married in the church. That expression, getting married in the church, has nothing to do with the building. You can get married in the church and not be inside the Catholic Church. What that means is, one of the parties is Catholic, and they have a bishop, priest, or deacon properly delegated to witness their marriage. In some exceptional circumstances, especially marital and missionary territory, it may even be a layperson delegated by the bishop to witness the marriage. So, all that means, getting married in the church, means you got married in accordance with the laws of the church. And the law of the church states that Catholics must be married in the presence of a Catholic witness, properly delegated, or get permission from the bishop to get married in some other way. So we call that a dispensation from form. So if you've got a couple that wants to get married, let's say it's a Catholic man, but the bride is the daughter of a Protestant minister, and she would like dad to do the wedding. The local bishop can give permission for her father, the Protestant minister, to do the wedding. And it's called a dispensation from the form of marriage. So that is possible. So in mixed marriages, it is possible for the local bishop to give a dispensation, saying, now, it doesn't matter whether the Catholic priest shows up at that wedding or not. Usually, because the Catholic priest had to prepare them for marriage, out of courtesy and his support for the couple, he will probably go to the wedding. But his presence there has no effect on the validity of the wedding. Another example, what about two Catholics who want to get married without the presence of a Catholic minister? Is that possible? It is possible if you get permission from the Holy See, from the Vatican, and they don't give it. If both of you are Catholics, you have to get married in the presence of a Catholic minister. That's part of the rules.
I hate to put you on the spot.
No problem.
What's the deal? The Pope, Francis, calls this woman in Argentina, you probably heard this,
Yes.
and she won't go to communion.
Right.
Because we're living in they were,
So Pope Francis gets a call from a woman who's not validly married.
he calls them, she wrote him a letter.
Oh, he calls her because he got
Because
a
he got the
letter.
letter.
And,
Basically said, I can't go to communion.
okay, she says, I can't go to communion, and he basically says, well, go ahead and go to communion anyway.
That's exactly what he said.
Well, we don't have Pope Francis' side of that story. We only have the
You've
woman's
heard
side of
it.
that story.
You've heard
Oh,
it.
absolutely.
Good answer.
We don't have Pope Francis' side of that story, so I won't comment on that. But I promise you, there are many times that people have asked a priest for a question, gotten a correct answer, and then reported an incorrect one. Oh, well, Father so-and-so told me that it was okay to live with my live-in boyfriend. No, I didn't say that at all. And if they say, but he told me in confession, then I can't even defend myself. I have to just sit back and let them, malign me, because I would never tell somebody that, but, it was a confession. I can't defend myself. So it's very easy to have misinformation. Let me give you an example of another ground of nullity. How about we were too young? How young is too young according to the laws of the Catholic Church? Guess. How
16.
old does the bride have to be?
13.
14.
That's the age of reason in the Catholic Church?
No, the age of reason is 7. The age of being able to validly consent to marriage is 14 for the girl and 16 for the guy. Now, people say that's absurd, Father. Well, yes, in the United States of America, that is absurd. But the Code of Canon Law has to apply to every country in the world. And there are some cultures where that's not absurd.
You don't want to.
Now, no comments on the Irish travelers now. Now, it could be argued, okay, we were too young. Well, how old was she? 15. How old were you? 16. You were stupid, but you weren't too young. Okay. Now, if you want to argue, now this is a rare ground of nullity, the ground of ignorance. That's the case where the couple comes together after the marriage. They're very young. They get into the bed, and she says, "Wait a minute, you're going to do what to me?" "Oh, no, you're not." Now, we're talking about somebody who's so ignorant of sex that she finds out on the wedding night what he intends to do, and she's like, Well, that's not a valid contract, is it?
It's failure to
Because she is
consummate.
ignorant of the very nature of what marriage is for. It is of its nature a conjugal union. So, but that is incredibly rare that you've got a case like that. But it is possible. What about they're too closely related? That's easy to prove, relatively. You get enough documentation, you submit it to the tribunal, the judge looks at the document and says, yeah, they are first cousins. That one's invalid, unless they had a dispensation from their bishop. The church will tolerate the marriage of first cousins. You cannot marry your sibling, even if it's a step sibling. No. You cannot marry your uncle or your aunt. But you can marry your first cousin with the prior permission of the church. And the bishop might be reluctant to give that permission, but yes.
If a couple, after married the Catholic Church, after having their first child, the wife refuses to get off of birth control devices, preventing any future children, would that be any grounds there?
Okay, so if they get married and then the wife refuses to get off of birth control
After having a child number one.
after having child number one, that would not be grounds for annulment. It would be immoral, it would be sinful, but it's not grounds for annulment. Remember that my question as a judge on the tribunal is always going to be, what was the state of mind and the circumstances of the people on the day they got married? Another one, which is incredibly rare, is lack of reason. That means that the guy is so utterly stoned he can barely mouth the words, "I do." It's rare, but that's an obvious case, isn't it? That's called psychic incapacity. Yes.
So, what if they get married? What is the church's stance on a couple that is a woman that is on the pill when they get married? What is that still a valid? I mean, does that come into factor at all? I mean, I don't think the Catholic Church does not condone or does it, or
No.
has that all worked together?
The church does not condone artificial contraception. That's a moral matter, not a legal matter.
Okay.
The legal matter, whether or not the marriage is valid, goes to what was her intention at the time she got married. Did she say, yeah, we'll have children later? Well, if she's saying later, she's open to children. But if her intention at the time was, I might have children with him after I've been with him for a year and see whether or not he's a good man. Well, then she's not really consenting to the whole package of marriage at the day of the wedding, is she? Or if she's saying, I don't intend to ever have children, then that would invalidate. Now, again, my talk today has been more about the nuts and bolts of how to put a marriage together and how to evaluate a marriage, whether or not it was valid. Like I promised you before, it's not the most inspirational topic in the world, but you can see why it is important. The Catholic Church does not have the authority to dissolve valid, consummated marriages between baptized people. And therefore, we are being faithful to Christ when we say that. Because our Lord said that what God has joined, man must not separate. And that means that we have to recognize our own limitations. Even the Pope cannot celebrate a marriage, a valid marriage between baptized people. Now, I could give you all kinds of examples all day long, but let me tell you that if people have a question, call me. If I'm not there, Anna, who's our canonist, our other canonist, she is very competent. Thank God for Anna. I couldn't keep the place running without her. She's a great canon lawyer. She knows what she's talking about. She can answer any kind of questions that you might have. When it comes to procedures, like how the annulments are processed, the parish priest probably doesn't know much about that. When we were in seminary, they did not teach us the procedure for an annulment case. They taught us about the grounds for nullity and what makes a marriage valid or not, but they didn't teach us the procedures. So if you want to know about procedures, you need to talk to me or Anna, or an advocate who has been trained in it. We want to help people, but sometimes the only help we can give them is by telling them, you have not proved that your marriage is invalid. Because if you weren't validly married the first time, and I just tell you, oh, well, that's fine, that wasn't really valid, I'm not doing you a favor. And I have to stand before God and answer for that one day. At the end of every sentence, so like I said, this is a judicial process, so at the end of the trial, there is a sentence by the judges. In this country, the Holy See will allow us to have a nullity case with one judge. I rarely allow nullity cases with one judge because there used to be a mandatory appeal where 3 judges had to look at it, but Pope Francis eliminated the appeal to speed up the process. So I'm of the opinion that it's better to have 3 judges, which is what is supposed to be the norm, look at the case rather than just one. There's only one case that I've ever done by myself because I thought it was pretty obvious. Usually it's got to be 3 judges. The 3 judges look at that, they write the sentence. At the beginning of the sentence it says, in the name of God, amen. They describe who the parties are. They describe the law of the church on marriage related to their case. They describe what they found in the testimony of the witnesses and the parties and the priest or whoever might have been interviewed. And then at the very end of it, they have to make a decision. And in that sentence it says, the turnus of judges, having invoked the divine name and having only God before their eyes, declare affirmative or negative. Think about that. Having invoked God's name and having only God before their eyes, meaning I don't care whether it's going to make you happy or not. I don't care whether it's going to make the bishop happy or not. I'm looking at me and God because on the day of judgment, I will have to answer for every single annulment case I've done. Having only God before my eyes, I am certain that this marriage was valid or invalid. Or actually, I don't have to be certain it's invalid. I presume it's valid until you prove otherwise. Yes?
Father, I'm curious, how would you describe the posture of the tribunal and or the diocese as it relates to an applicant? And the reason why I'm asking is that for those that are seeking annulment, having been through one, it is a time of great heartache,
Yes, it can be
a time of great
yes.
stress. I could go on, and it's a time when many don't feel lovable for those that have been left. It is a time when a heart desires to be loved in a pastoral, just a pastoral nature. What is, so that we might love our brothers and sisters more effectively as the body of Christ, even though we're not advocates in this room. So when I say advocates, in that particular role, right? We're advocates for marriage, we're advocates for truth, but how might we serve as a loving body of Christ to help our brothers and sisters in that process?
Well, one of the best things we can do to help people who are applying is to be merciful with them. Don't automatically assume you got a divorce, therefore you're a bad person. I think we're beyond that in this society. In fact, we've gone too far to the other extreme. You got a divorce? Whatever. Divorce is still a tragedy. Just ask the children. And divorce can be a sin. If you don't have grounds for divorcing, then it's a sin. Now, of course, there are obvious grounds for divorce, such as for your own personal safety, because your husband beats you, just one very obvious example. But don't presume that you know the motives of the people who have been divorced. If they mention to you that, well, I got divorced, but I can't afford an annulment, we do not charge in the Diocese of Memphis. We have the right to charge, but we do not, because there was a rumor that happened in this diocese 50 years ago about a particular wealthy couple, and the guy was a doctor, I think, and he was able to get an annulment back in the days when it was even harder to get one. And they said, well, if you've got enough money, then you can get one. It has nothing to do with money. Let them know. You don't have to pay a thing. We will send you a letter at the end of the case saying this is how much we spent on your case. If you'd like to make a donation, we appreciate it. That's it. Also, it's very important to help people if you know that they're applying and they say, I got that questionnaire and I'm not doing that. I'm just not doing it. That can be very painful when people open up that questionnaire and start trying to answer those questions. I've heard some people tell me, that one person in particular said, you know, it was difficult, but I actually found it to be a healing experience because it forced me to really confront some issues that I had never really thought seriously about. And that's a good thing. So other people, they say, I hated every minute of it, I'll never do it again. I understand. But the important thing is to help them and encourage them. Tell them that, explain to them that this is something that they really need to do to help get themselves right with the church. Because if they intend to marry again, they have to. Unfortunately, our time is up. I'm willing to stay behind and answer any questions you might have. I love talking about this stuff. This is what I do. Also, if you've got people who ask you to be a witness for their case, that is one of the best things you can do for them. If you know something about the marriage and they ask you to be a witness, get it in, get your testimony in sooner. The sooner you get it in, the quicker we can process the case. That's also very important. But always remember, the thing that we have to keep in mind, and the thing that the judge has to keep in mind, what's God only before his eyes, is that what God has joined, no man can separate. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.